We're joined now by Kurt Hackbarth, who is a journalist out of Mexico. Has written some really great pieces for Jacobin. I'm really excited to have him help break down for us some of these recent events in Mexico, and most notably this recall election. Before we get too bogged down in it, how's it going, Kurt?
Good, thanks. Great victory there by Greg Abbott there with a Nuevo Laredo. That was. Can we just say that we don't want Greg Abbott down here at all in any way? So if you could arrange to keep him up there, we'd all be very happy about that.
Well, I think it'd probably be good for all of us.
Yeah. Or somewhere else, but not here.
I mean, he truly is a fucking character, man. Lord in heaven. But we wanted to bring you on. I mean, there's a lot to get to,
Yeah.
that's been happening in Mexico. But I wanted to start first, just, giving people, kind of brief update, because there was an election over the weekend. Could you sort of break down for people what this recall election was against AMLO and, the story behind it?
Sure. So on this past Sunday, Mexico held its first ever recall election, which is obviously a historic event in the country, which the president, López Obrador, won overwhelmingly with over 90% of the vote. He won over 15 million votes, which is actually more than he won in his first presidential campaign. So it was actually a good show of strength in that respect. It's important to note, because I think most US media avoids this point, is that AMLO was doing this to fulfill a campaign promise. He called the recall. This wasn't an opposition called recall. This wasn't a California situation with, Gray Davis, Schwarzenegger, and all that. AMLO, in all of his three presidential campaigns, had a plank to submit himself to a recall election halfway through his presidency. Because the Mexican presidency is long. It's 6 years. It's one of the longest terms in the democratic world. And this was a plank of his in all of his three presidential campaigns. And actually, when he was mayor of Mexico City, the second democratically elected mayor of Mexico City, he also did the same thing there. He called a recall halfway through, which he won. So the summary is that AMLO was fulfilling a campaign promise here to call a recall. And we can talk about this in a moment. He won by such an overwhelming number, first because he's a very popular president, but because the opposition chickened out. They didn't want to play ball, right? We can talk about why in a minute, but just to give the quick summary, the recall was a presidential initiative. When AMLO and his party Morena won the election in 2018, they amended the Constitution, together with Congress and the state legislatures, to include referenda and recall in the Constitution. Mexico didn't have that before. So now the Mexican Constitution has binding referenda and recalls in there. There's already been one binding referendum, which the opposition also boycotted. And now they're 2 for 2 boycotting this recall.
I mean, this is the thing that's so interesting about so much of the opposition to AMLO. I mean, you can think about him however you want politically, but this is somebody who is using this position, as you noted, even when he was mayor, to sort of expand some kind of system of what we might call a more direct democracy, instead of a kind of mediated thing where, you're just voting for candidates every few years.
That's absolutely right. And I think it's even more significant in the context of Mexican politics, because of the concentration of executive power that has historically existed. The president's rule for 6 years, during the time of the PRI, they were practically, fixed-term dictators, when the PRI governed Mexico uninterruptedly for over 70 years. According to the Mexican Constitution before the recall, the president can only be removed from office for basically treason against the country, which is very hard to prove. They could basically, in a certain sense, do almost what they wanted. And the governors of each state were like, little mini dictators within their own fiefs. This changed finally with, alternation of power, and especially with, the victory of Morena in 2018. But without some form of direct democracy, it would still be, as you say, a very mediated system, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a recall at a national level finally gives the opportunity for people. Imagine if you had another terrible president like Felipe Calderón, which made a bloodbath, which, first of all, stole the election in a fraudulent election in 2006, and then turned the country into a bloodbath. Imagine a mechanism then to recall Felipe Calderón, how many lives would have been saved? Or Enrique Peña Nieto, this frivolous kind of, boy power kind of president who, sold out Mexico's oil industry by trying to privatize Pemex. Imagine, which was incredibly unpopular. Imagine if there'd been a recall mechanism then to stop some of these disastrous presidencies before, they ground on for 6 years without anything being able to. So that's the important thing here, establishing a precedent. Not that AMLO is ever going to be removed from office. He's very popular, but for the future.
Can you talk about that a little bit more about the opposition to AMLO and the position they're in, where they're simultaneously calling him a tyrant of some sort, and there's a lot of Trump comparisons. I feel like we talked about this last time we talked with you, but like I'm trying to imagine Trump saying, "Yeah, we need a recall system to make sure there's accountability." That's not very Trump-like, right? Like, so just flesh that out for us a little bit.
Right. Kind of the only Western optic to view Latin American leaders, and especially Latin American leaders anywhere, on the center left, is that they're authoritarian populists. Mm-hmm. There's absolutely no other optic with which the standard Western media can view a Latin American president. So anything will be seen through that optic. Right? Knowing this, Mexico's opposition, which is a coalition now of right-wing parties, the PRI, the right-wing PAN, and a few other smaller parties, kind of did their math when the recall was coming up and realized that they were going to lose. They, realized they had no chance of winning this. At first, the opposition was planning on participating in the recall. Then they realized they were going to lose. They changed their minds, right? Knowing that, or, they could get the gullible US media to go along with this idea that it was a demagogic exercise in aggrandizing presidential power, which is exactly what the New York Times said. I underlined every dumb thing they said in this article. So if we've got 4 hours later, we can go through that. So it was just a chicken shit idea that instead of losing the recall, they were going to try to tar the recall as an exercise in demagogy, right? And that's what they set out to do. They set out to say, the recall is just López Obrador trying to increase his power, trying to increase his legitimacy, and whatever else. AMLO has no need to increase his legitimacy. He's already legitimate. The presidency by 30 points, and he's very popular. He doesn't need this. No?
Yeah, but also I would say, like, increasing popular accountability, that's a good form of increasing legitimacy.
That's actually good, right? Allowing people to vote on whether a president should remain, right? So the opposition set out to try to undermine the whole exercise by saying it was unnecessary, it was expensive, it was this, it was that, which its high point was this kind of Monty Python-esque farce on the Sunday before the recall, in which the opposition set out to launch a march, the right-wing opposition, in Mexico City with the slogan "Termina se te vas," which is finish your term and then leave. Okay. Considering the president in Mexico can't be reelected, that's exactly what AMLO was going to do. Going to finish his term and leave. So they marched, telling him very strongly to finish his term and leave. Pretty impressive. And as you said, that, important figures in the opposition over the last 3 years have been saying to anyone who will listen that AMLO is the next Hitler. Mm-hmm. He's a Mussolini figure. He's a Duce, and he's in the practice of perpetuating coup d'états. He's a dictator. He's a menace. So with all of this, hyperbolic rhetoric of AMLO as Hitler, Mussolini, a fascist and a communist, kind of a mashup, anything that's bad, anything that sounds bad, right? Then they get the opportunity to throw the man out in a recall ahead of his term, because he's obviously a terrible monster. I mean, who would want someone like that to remain in office even 5 more minutes? But no, we're not going to do the recall.
I mean, that's the cowardly thing about most of the opposition stuff that I was seeing for folks. It's like, if he is so illegitimate and unpopular, then he opened himself up to you. Like, take your chance right now. I mean, you've broken down a good bit of this, but I also just wanted to ask you. One, I remember reading in your piece that he had initially tried to hold this in the midterms, right, when there would necessarily be more turnout, and the opposition opposed that. Could you also break down the INE, the Electoral Commission, and sort of what they did in this most recent election? Because I've also heard that there was a lot of complaints about there being sort of lack of funding, and it was sort of difficult for some people to be able to show up to polls.
Well, the Electoral Institute down here, the National Electoral Institute of the INE, is a bastion of conservatism, and the leaders, Lorenzo Cordova and Ciro Moriyama, have been doing everything possible to gum up the works, not only in this, but the previous referendum that was held on exploring, and investigating the crimes of former presidents. The INE claims that there wasn't enough of a budget to carry out the recall. The INE is one of the most expensive electoral institutes in the world. It receives one of the biggest budgets of any electoral institute in any country. Now, conservatives will say it's because the INE performs more functions. Well, their main function is to carry out elections. I mean, which they don't do very well, because in this case, they only opened up 1/3 of the precincts. Mm-hmm. And then AMLO got 15 million votes. Imagine that, only 1/3 of the precincts were open. I mean, that's like voter suppression that even beats Texas.
Yeah.
Which is something. And not only that, but a lot of the precincts were changed. You had changed places. So,
oh Lord,
the precinct where the people vote here in the neighborhood is usually at a school a couple blocks away. This time it wasn't at the school; it was at a place in another neighborhood. How did you have to find that out? You had to go online and go into an app and figure it out, or go into the website. Well, a lot of people here are poor, and they don't have smartphones, and they don't have internet access as easily. So it's not that easy for them to go on there and find out where the precinct was. Now, if they claim they didn't have a lot of money, at least what they could have done is go to the old precinct and put up a sign. That would have been nice, right? The voting isn't here, it's somewhere else, and there's the address. But they didn't do that because they're not interested in turnout. The whole idea is to undermine the whole process, right, from the get-go. These commissioners at the INE have fantastic salaries. They receive a higher salary than the president. They've actually gone to court to try to keep their large salaries because the Constitution says that no one in the federal government should make more than the president. So they've got their interests in mind. The promotion of the event was very scant. There was very little promotion. They did the bare minimum, right? And then would penalize people or punish political parties like Morena for trying to promote the referendum, which is fine because electoral law prohibits political parties from promoting the referendum because the idea is it be a partisan exercise. But they don't know anybody else to promote it, but then they're not going to promote it themselves, right? And then the people who were promoting the idea of the boycott, they weren't punished at all because technically they weren't promoting recall, they were promoting not recall. So it becomes silly. It becomes silly because not because they were, applying electoral law, which they have to do. It's because they were doing it in bad faith. And it was obvious that they were doing it in bad faith because they didn't want this thing to succeed, right? Because they didn't want, what they knew was going to be AMLO's victory and a shot in the arm for the movement, because it was a shot in the arm for the movement. They turned out 15 million people on Palm Sunday for a recall that was not lined up with any other election. There was no other election that day. It's hard to get people out for a recall if there's no other election that day, unless it's been heavily, heavily, heavily promoted. This is the beginning of Holy Week down here. A lot of people are traveling. They go back to their pueblos. They're going home. They finally, people down here don't get a lot of vacation, so they're going back to their pueblos and going back to see their families. Getting 15 million people, actually the 16.5 million people voted in total, 15 million in favor of AMLO. That's a pretty impressive. That's a pretty impressive number. That's a pretty impressive show of organizing muscle, and it got people motivated. I think one of the big things on the left that's always an important thing that's always been debated, right, is people get motivated for an election, and then they get demotivated, and then they get motivated for another election, and then they get demotivated. And it goes like this in cycles, and it doesn't work that way. You have to be motivated constantly. You do that. That's been a big debate. Well, this recall did get people motivated, and it got people out. Just before a big vote, a big showdown this week in Congress about AMLO's energy reform constitution. Mm-hmm. So it was timely in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, again, as somebody who, I'm a big believer in democracy and like trying to get the people as close to power as possible. So I have a hard time sort of reckoning with anybody who treats these things as a bad thing.